We were checking earlier, and it should be okay from the distance.
Okay, so hello everybody. We are happy to be at the presentation for the PhD by Eva Gil San Antonio. She will defend her project entitled Stockage intelligent sur ADN synthétique pour l'archivage des données numériques. I tell it in French.
That's okay.
We are happy to have a very nice jury, and after your presentation, I will give the floor to the different members for that will ask you some questions. So the three direct reviewer are Professor Thomas Ainis from Imperial College in London, who has been our very active coordinator of the European project OligoArchive, and with a specialist in the field of DNA storage. The second person is Professor Dominique Lavenier of Rennes, with a specialist in genomics and bioinformatics, and who also belong to the Molecular Archive EPR. And the third reviewer will be Professor Athanasios Kodras from the University of Patras, with Professor of Digital Systems at this university. And then we will have several examinators, including Anthony Genot from Tokyo, who is a specialist on molecular programming and DNA computing, and Professor Rainer Eckel from Munich, who was a very early investigator in the field of DNA storage, and who has contributed to a very famous paper in that domain. And also Professor Olgika Milenkovic from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, who has also contributed in this field. We have an invited member with Laura Condé Canancia, who is at this time Director of Strategic Collaboration and IP at Catalog, and with specialists in special type of decoders. And I think that I have just to finish with Marc Antonini, your Director of Thesis, and myself, I am Pascal Barbry, and we have worked for some time with you. And so it's your turn. You have 40 minutes or so. Or
45.
45. I'll let you the 45, no problem. And perhaps you can jump to 50 if you wish. And then it will be the turn to the jury.
Okay. Give me 1 second to move them, because I cannot find my mouse here. How to put this back. I will share my screen. Is it okay for everyone to see the slides in the people connected online?
Yes.
Okay. So hello everyone, and thank you for coming to my PhD defense. My work focuses on the intelligent storage on synthetic DNA for archiving digital images, and it has been supervised by Dr. Marc Antonini, as Pascal said. This is a brief outline of the content that we followed during the presentation, started by the introduction. And I would like to start this presentation by answering the question, why is it so important to find new ways to store digital data? The explosion of digital media has led to an exponential increase of the amount of data generated worldwide. The total amount of data created, copied, and consumed is expected to grow to up to more than 175 zettabytes by 2025. Just for you to have an idea of what it means, we generate 2.5 quintillion data every day, which would be the equivalent to 10,000 billion photos taken with your smartphones. 90% of the digital data has been generated in the past 2 years. And between 60 and 80% of it is what we know as cold, which means that it's very frequently accessed. While the cold data growth is around 60% per year, the improvement in storage density is at most 20% per year. This means that if we want to store all of the world's data with the current storage media, like, for example, Blu-ray discs, we will need a stack of Blu-ray discs that will reach the moon 23 times. In order to keep up with all these storage needs, we have built more than 8 billion data centers worldwide so far, and the environmental impact that they have in our world can be ignored. Currently, data centers generate as much carbon emissions as the global airline industry, with some models saying that the energy consumption doubles every 4 years. And it has been estimated that the energy usage could reach 10% of the global electricity supply by 2030. Just a medium-sized data center consumes as much water as 3 average-sized hospitals. And every year, we generate between 20 to 50 million metric tons of server, storage, and equipment, which are thrown away. So what's the DNA? DNA is a large molecule composed by 4 elements, which are called nucleotides, and that we denote by the letters A, C, T, and G. And it is the carrier of the information in living organisms. And the biological properties of DNA make it a very strong candidate to replace current storage media, starting by the longevity. Very recently, scientists successfully recovered the DNA of a woolly mammoth that had been trapped into permafrost for 1.6 million years, and this DNA was still readable. It also allows the storage of information at a very high density, and we have estimated that all of the world's data could be stored in less than 1 kilo of DNA, which fits in the size of a shoebox. It's also important to mention that it allows very quick and easy in vitro replication that allows to generate redundancy. So we already saw why we need to find new storage solutions and why DNA is a very strong candidate for that. But how do we actually store data into DNA? So every digital data, in our case an image, can be encoded into DNA as soon as it's first represented with a quaternary alphabet, which will be using the 4 symbols of DNA, A, C, T, and G. Once we have our strand encoding our data, it can be biochemically synthesized in a lab, and then if we store it under the right conditions, it can be preserved for hundreds or even thousands of years without losing its integrity. Whenever this data has to be retrieved, we can first we will amplify using a process that it's called polymerase chain reaction that creates many copies of the initial sequences, and we do that to generate some redundancy. And then all these copies will be read with some special machines that are called sequencers that decipher the content of the DNA strands. Since sequencing, the sequencing process is error-prone, at the end of this stage, we will have a pool that contains many noisy copies of the initial sequences. So from all these copies, we have to generate a consensus to try to correct the errors that have appeared during the sequencing process, and then decode the sequence following the inverse process that we use to encode. However, as I said, these processes are error-prone, and the errors appear in the form of insertions of nucleotides, substitutions of nucleotides, and deletion of nucleotides. And these errors mainly come from the biological processes that are involved in the DNA data storage channel, which significantly increase the complexity of the whole process. So among these source of errors, we have synthesis, which currently limits the length of the synthesized DNA to up to around 300 nucleotides. if we want to control the error that is introduced, and the error increases exponentially for longer strands. For storage, DNA is prone to chemical decay, to lose integrity if it's not stored under the optimal conditions. Regarding PCR, which is the process I mentioned to increase the redundancy, it introduces certain bias in the number of copies that it creates, as it has predisposition towards certain sequences over others. For example, a sequence that has a high GC content tend to generate a less number of copies. And finally, sequencing, which is the main source of errors, and the error rates increase if the sequences contain homopolymers, which is the same symbol repeated several times in a row, patterns, or an unbalanced GC content. So the good news here is that we can control the errors in synthesis and storage if we limit the length of the synthesized strands according to the technology that is being used, and if we store this DNA in a control environment, such as, for example, sealed capsules or silica glass. And we mainly focus on the errors that come from the PCR and sequencing steps, which we will have to minimize by respecting the constraints that these processes impose. This PhD work has been carried out under the OligoArchive Consortium that is being funded by the European Union under the program Horizon 2020, and it aims for the development of an end-to-end solution for data storage using DNA. And the partners are the I3S Laboratory and IPMC, both of them from CNRS here in Sophia Antipolis, Eurecom, also here in Sophia Antipolis, Imperial College of London, and Helixworks, which is a startup in Ireland. Now we will move to the state of the art, and we are going to focus mostly on the state of the art on DNA coding. So the first attempt to store DNA into, to store data into DNA was presented by Church and his team in 2012. And it provided the first study on the sequencing errors and also the coding constraints. And from this point, the coming work started introducing constraint codes to respect the biochemical constraints that we just discussed, and propose mechanisms for error correction. So, for example, we have in 2013, Goldman proposed the first constraint code using a ternary Huffman to avoid homopolymers in the strands. In 2015, Grass proposed the first error detection and correction using Brett-Solomon codes. And in 2015, we have the work of Yatsi and its team, which proposed a way to edit DNA and also allow random access. And it was focused mostly for the sequencing, the Sanger sequencing, which is the one that is used in Illumina, which is one of the accurate sequencers. We also have more other works in 2016 from Blauat and Erich that also propose error detection and correction mechanisms, but we won't enter in detail. And then in 2016, the team again of Yatsi proposed another method for random access, but this time for nanopore sequencing, which has a much higher error rate than the case of Illumina sequencers. I would like to stop here for a moment to mention that during these early stages of DNA data storage, most of the method focus on encoding any kind of digital data by translating from binary to quaternary using some constraint code and then adding redundancy to correct errors. In the case of images, most of the works were proposing to compress the binary file before with some classical technique like JPEG, and then to transcode, to translate from the compressed binary data into quaternary using, again, some constraint code and adding redundancy for error correction. However, as the field of DNA coding grew, more works are starting to adapt the proposed encodings to the source that they were targeting. And more concretely, since 2019, from the media coding group, we here in I3S, which I'm part of, have proposed various encoding solutions for the storage of digital images. And among the solutions, we can find a constraint quaternary code that we call percode that respects the biochemical constraints and that has been integrated in different encoding workflows. Like, for example, a fixed length DNA coder, which is based on discrete wavelet transform and vector quantization, and a variable length coder that was inspired by the main workflow of classical JPEG. We have also proposed some other encodings for images, such as, for example, a constrained Shannon-Fano entropy coder. There are some other works. Sorry, I forgot to say that since it's very important to adapt the encoding methods to the kind of data that we aim to encode, so we can ensure we can create the standards and ensure the interoperability and the long-term decodability of the data. In 2020, the group JPEG DNA was created for the creation of a standard to store digital images and videos into DNA. And there are also some other works that have focused on the storage of images, such as, for example, the work of Pan and his team in 2021, which proposed to store quantized images, integrating Huffman coding and post-processing to correct the discolorations that remain after decoding. And some other works like the JPEG transcoder, which has been specifically designed and adapted to JPEG compressed binary data. And it has been motivated by the large amount of digital images that are already stored using the JPEG format and as an attempt to ease the migration from binary-based storage system to DNA-based storage systems. So regarding the contributions that we have presented in this PhD, they can be divided in 4 groups, 4 main subjects. First of all, as we just saw, the biochemical processes involved in the channel are prone to errors. So it is very important to develop codes that are robust to noise and also ensure the decodability of the data, even in the presence of errors. So with that purpose, we proposed an alternative encoding schema for the JPEG-inspired DNA coder that I mentioned just now in the state of the art, to increase the robustness as also ensure the decodability even in the presence of errors, and also an in-painting solution adapted to the wavelet domain, which is the case of the fixed length code proposed by the media coding team, which also includes an automatic detection of the errors. The second subject focuses on handling the nanopore sequencing noise. So we have different types of sequencers with different assets. For example, in the case of Illumina sequencing, is very accurate in the process, but is very slow and expensive. And there are other technologies such as nanopore, which allow to sequence the data much faster and cheaper, but in exchange of a higher error rate. So since one of our goals in this thesis is to integrate nanopore sequencing in the workflow, we also designed a decoding schema for nanopore sequence data, which also integrates a novel consensus finding algorithm for non-complete dictionaries in the decoder. And we also use some experimental error rates to validate a nanopore sequencing simulator, which are very important because they allow to quickly test and develop different algorithms for DNA coding. We also perform a wet lab experiment in which we compare different encoding algorithms proposed by the media coding group and different sequencing technologies to have some insights on the trade-off that we need between compression and robustness. And finally, we also propose the theoretical foundations for an encoding schema for synthesis by ligation, which is an emerging synthesis that is being researched right now, and that was motivated because this new synthesis by ligation promises to allow to generate much larger strands and also cheaper. However, for time reasons, we are only gonna go into detail with 2 of these contributions. And we will start with the alternative encoding schema for the JPEG-inspired DNA coder. So, as I said in previous works, the team proposed this variable length solution, which is inspired by the main workflow of classical JPEG, starting by applying a discrete wavelet transform in blocks of 8 by 8 pixels. And then the DC and AC coefficients that come from the DCT are encoded with the classical JPEG using two binary encodings, which are binary Huffman and classical binary encoding. So in the solution that the media coding team proposed, these two binary encodings have been replaced by quaternary one, so we can adapt it to DNA. And more concretely, we use ternary Huffman with the Goldman encoding to avoid homopolymers, and per code, which is the constraint code that we presented in 2019. However, although variable length codes offer the advantage of providing a much more compressed representation of the input data, they are also usually less robust to errors. And this is critical if we talk about the DC coefficients that we obtain after the DCT, which contain critical information. And if errors appear in these coefficients, we can risk to lose even the structure of the image. Here you have some examples of what would happen when we add errors in the DC coefficients for the proposed JPEG-inspired DNA coder. And in some cases, after a certain point, we even lose the structure of the image, even when we have very low error rates, such as in this case, that is just a 0.05 of substitution errors. So what we propose is to change the variable encoding that we use to encode the DC coefficients, which are the critical ones, by a fixed length one. And more concretely, what we propose is to use vector quantization and then to map these vectors to DNA code words that have been constructed with per code, the constraint code. And additionally, we use another algorithm that we also propose from the team to map these quantization vectors to the DNA code words in a way that it confers resistance to substitution errors. So this mapping algorithm was inspired by the work of Mark and his team in 1987, and they proposed an algorithm for mapping vectors to binary words while being resistant to single word errors which are inserted by a binary symmetric channel. So under the assumption that the substitution introduced during the sequencing stage can be considered as bit error noise introduced in digital channels, we extended this algorithm to work in quaternary code, and we use it to robustify the mapping of the quantization vectors to the DNA code words. So the goal of this algorithm is not to avoid errors or to correct errors, but to minimize the impact that these errors have in our data. And for that, the main idea is to map the code vectors which are close in terms of Euclidean distance to quaternary words that have a Hamming distance of 1, which is the equivalent to a substitution error. And as a result, the error will be decoded as a vector which is close to the correct one, and hence minimizing the impact on the visual results of the decoded image. We are going to see one example to understand a bit better. So suppose that we have here this codebook sigma to be mapped, it's a codebook of vector sigma to be mapped to this dictionary, constraint dictionary of quaternary words, C star. And let's also assume that we have this Hamming sphere for the word C1, which contains, C1 will be the center, 88, and contains all the words that have a Hamming distance of 1 to the center. Again, that is a substitution error. And then let's also assume this neighborhood S to the vector V1, which contains the closest vectors from sigma to the vector V1. So now let's say that we map those two sets using a simple one-to-one mapping. In this case, the word CTA that belongs to the Hamming sphere of our target word right now, 88, has been mapped to a vector that is very far from the original one, and it doesn't belong to the set of neighboring vectors. In this case, if an error occurs and this word 88 gets transformed into the word CTA because of a substitution, the impact of the error in the decoded image will be high. However, if we control this mapping, making sure that all the vectors in the same neighborhood are mapped to words that belong to the same Hamming sphere, if the same error occurs, this erroneous code word CTA will be decoded as the vector V11, which is much closer than V10 to the original one V1. And in this case, when we decode the image, the impact of the error is much lower. However, as we have been saying on the presentation, we are using a constrained quaternary code, and that means that some of the code words are omitted in our dictionary because they are not viable from a DNA coding point of view. So that means that if we have a substitution error, we have two scenarios. The substitution transforms the word into another word that exists in our dictionary, C star, and then thanks to the mapping algorithm, the impact of the error is going to be minimized. Or the second scenario in which the error transforms the original word into a word that doesn't exist in our dictionary. And in these cases, we need to find a way to assign some vector to this word that doesn't exist in our dictionary. So to deal with this, what we proposed is to do the decoding in two cycles. In the first cycle, we are going to decode all the decodable words, and we will do the spatial reconstruction of the image, leaving the blanks on the places where there should be where there are the undecodable erroneous words. And in the second step, we will fill those blanks. And to fill those blanks, we have tested 4 different methods. A very simple baseline, and then we have tested another 3 methods under the assumption that since we are talking about images, neighboring elements in the image will be correlated. So first, the baseline, simply we decoded by 0 the undecodable errors. So in this, we also propose another method that we call advanced correction decoding that works under the assumption that if the substitution rate is low enough, so we find at most 1 error per word, with high probability, the code word that we are looking for will belong to the Hamming sphere of the erroneous word. And also, since there exists a spatial correlation among the neighboring pixels of an image, the correct vector will be with high probability close to the neighboring vectors in the spatial domain to where the error is located. To be more clear, if we look at the schema, let's say that W is our undecodable error, and here we have the Hamming sphere, which contains all the words in our dictionary that have a Hamming distance of 1 to the undecodable error. And we also have the set VH that contains all the vectors that have been mapped to all these words. And here in the left, we have, again, the undecodable errors, but here would be a representation of the spatial domain after the first cycle of decoding, with all the neighboring words, and also the set VC, which contains all the vectors that are mapped to the neighboring words to the target one. So what we are trying to do here is to find the intersection between the sets VH and VC. If we find an intersection with more than one possible vectors, we will select the one with highest frequency. If there is no intersection between these two sets, what we will do then is to compute the average Euclidean distance between each of the vectors of VH and the set VC. And we will assign, as for decoding, the vector from VH with minimum average Euclidean distance. And being that this method couldn't address all the errors that we were facing, we decided to go one step further and propose a variation of this method in which we consider all the sets S, which contains the closest vectors to the center, for each of the vectors contains in VH. And we will compute the average Euclidean distance between each of the sets here and the set VC. And we will select for decoding the vector from VH whose set provided the lowest average Euclidean distance. Finally, we also propose a solution based on inpainting. Mainly we use a coherent transport algorithm since the errors that we are addressing are known are rather small. And we start with a binary mask that we already have after the first cycle of decoding. And then we will estimate the values of the target pixels from the neighboring pixels with known values. Here we have the results. We tested this new robustified JPEG for DNA in the Kodak dataset that has 25 images. And we added 0.2% of substitution errors in the DC coefficients to see how our solution improves the robustness of the original proposed JPEG for DNA. Here in red, we can see the average peak SNR that we obtained when using the original proposed JPEG for DNA, which is not robustified. And in average, we got a 7.25 dBs. However, in green, we can see the average results that we got when we robustified the DC coefficients with VQ and percode, just by modifying the variable length to fixed length. And in blue, we have the extra improvement that we achieve when we use the controlled mapping algorithm that we just saw. Although there were no significant difference between the different decoding methods proposed, inpainting seemed to act a bit better, giving an average improvement of 25.4 dBs. Here you can see the decoding results of the stored images. This is with the original proposed JPEG for DNA. Here we can see the one that we robustify with fixed length code and with fixed length code plus the mapping. And we can see that in the case in which we are using also the mapping algorithm, we can visually the impact of the errors is much lower. If we make it a bit, we see a little bit from closer. And if we focus, for example, in these two that I mark here, which is the same error in both cases, you can see how in the case in which we don't use norm to robustify, the impact of these two substitutions is much higher than in the case in which we use the mapping algorithm to reduce the impact. Now we are gonna talk about the wet lab experiment that we carried. As I mentioned earlier, from the media coding team, we have proposed different encoding solutions, and the goal of this experiment is to test those solutions. So these solutions are the fixed length solution based on VQ, the variable length solution based on JPEG adapted to DNA, which is the original one, not the robustified one that I just presented, and the simple transcoding of the binary output of classical JPEG that serves as a baseline as well. So, although sometimes transcoding algorithms are better performance in terms of compression than even the variable length codes, which is important due to the high cost of DNA synthesis, they also tend to be less robust to errors. So in this experiment, we attempt to get some insights about the trade-off between compression and robustness that we need in our code. As you can see in the left side of the image, we store different images for each of the solutions. But however, we make sure that we store the same grayscale image in the three cases for comparison purposes. This is the workflow of the experiment that we follow, starting by encoding and formatting the data. Since we aim to compare the robustness of the different algorithms and therefore the quality of the decoded image, in this case, we fixed the quality for the encoding. So we will have the same quality for all the solutions. And that led to different compression rates, as you can see, being the lowest one, the fixed length, and the best one with transcoding. And then the data was formatted into oligos of 200 nucleotides and the formatting was adapted to the needs of each of the encodings. Then the oligos were synthesized by Twist Bioscience company that performs phosphoramides chemistry, and they were stored in a DNA shell mini capsule that was provided by Imagen company. And this capsule is hermetically sealed, and it protects the DNA from contact with water, oxygen, light, which are harmful for the sequences. The sequencing was carried out in the IPMC laboratory. Thank you, Pascal. And we use two different sequencing technologies. Sequencing by synthesis that, as we said, is more accurate, like for example, the case of Illumina, but it's slow and expensive. And we did 3 runs of nanopore sequencing, which, as we say, has a lower accuracy, but is faster and cheaper. I would like also to remark that first, we did 3 of the sequencing runs at the same time, 1 with Illumina and 2 with MinION, which is a nanopore sequencer. And the difference between the 2 sequencing runs with MinION is that in one of them, they use a different method for the sequencing that is inspired by this paper, and basically it uses the circular consensus applied in packed biosequencers, which is a different type of sequencer, to increase the accuracy of the nanopore sequencing. And then a little bit later, in 2002, there was a new flow cell that appeared for the PromethION device, which is basically the same as MinION, but with a higher throughput. It has a higher number of nanopore channels. However, since this flow cell was only available for this device, we tested it with PromethION instead of with MinION, but it's again nanopore sequencing. Once we had our sequence reads, we used the tool developed by Eurecom that is called One Consensus, that uses CGK embedding to embed the sequences from the edit space to the Hamming space, and like that reduce the computational complexity. And then it uses the Hamming local T-sensitive hashing to group together similar reads. And like that, it creates clusters that group all the noisy copies from a reference. And from all these copies, it extracts a consensus that is computed using classical consensus, which means that we assign to each position in the sequence the most frequent symbol along the cluster. And finally, the only thing remaining is to deformat the data and to decode. And we are going to see some of the results that we obtained from this experiment, starting by the error rates. So I would like to remark mostly 2 things from these results, and it's that if we compare the accuracies of MinION R2C2 and normal MinION, the R2C2 method managed to improve the accuracy, making the error rates more than 5 times smaller than with normal MinION, and comparable to the latest flow cell for nanopore that it has proved to be the most accurate with PromethION. And another interesting fact that we extracted from here is that the ratio of each type of error remains constant for the 3 sequencing runs with nanopore. We also show here the distribution of the edit distance at the read level. The edit distance is the number of insertions, deletions, and substitutions that appear in a sequence. And if we compare the cases, again, of normal MinION with the most accurate ones, the R2C2 and PromethION, we can see that while in MinION, only 11% of the reads have an edit distance of lower than 5, in the case of MinION and PromethION, it's for 80% of the reads that this distance is lower than 5. And the high error rates provided by MinION made the data that we sequenced non-decodable. We couldn't retrieve any of the images. However, for the rest of the sequencers, here we show the case of Illumina, MinION R2C2, and PromethION for each of the encoding solutions tested. So for the case of Illumina, we can see how the fixed length solution provided a perfect reconstruction of the data, while the variable length solution and the transcoding case didn't manage to give so good results. For the cases of MinION-R2C2 and PromethION, I would like to start by pointing out that although they have very similar error rates, the case for the decoding for MinION-R2C2 is significantly worse than for the case of PromethION. And one of the explanations that we have for that is the coverage. So coverage is the number of copies that you have in average for each of the initial sequences. And as you can see, for the case of MinION with R2C2, we only have 65 copies in average per read, while in the case of PromethION, we had 1,500, which allowed to correct better the errors thanks to the consensus. And another thing that we can extract from these results is the importance of having robust mechanisms for encoding, especially when we have low coverage, because as you can see here, transcoding at some point loses the structure of the image and doesn't allow to have a good quality of the reconstructed image. And in order to compare the robustness of the three encoding methods, we also show here the comparison of the edit distance, average edit distance for each of the encoding solutions, which again is the average number of errors that we find in the sequences that are encoding for each of the solutions. And we compare it with the peak SNR, which is the quality of the decoded image. And it's especially interesting to focus on the case of MinION-R2C2, in which we can see that for the case of transcoding, for example, we have the lowest average edit distance. However, the peak SNR is also the lowest one. So it gave the worst quality results, while for the fixed length solution, this distance is higher, 2.4, and despite that, the quality of the decoded image was much higher. So just to finish, during this thesis, we have shown the importance of adapting the encoding solutions to the target data to ensure the decodability of the data rather than pure transcoding approaches, and that it's also important to have a good trade-off between compression and robustness. We have also integrated the use of nanopore sequencing devices despite their higher rate, and we have also proposed solutions for post-processing to correct the persistent errors that we mentioned, but we didn't go in detail. And also, we presented the wet lab results that prove the feasibility of DNA data storage, which is developing quick also thanks to the quick improvement and evolution of the sequencing technologies. And now we hope that synthesis. Regarding the future works, in the short term, we want to extend the mapping algorithm to also treat insertions and deletions of errors. So that would be either embedding maybe the sequences into Hamming space, or to use, instead of Hamming distance, the edit distance that also consider those. We also would like to develop a consensus for non-complete dictionaries, which would be integrated in a variable length coding, following the one that we already proposed for the fixed length coding. Also, the use of neural networks to filter out noisy raw reads before clustering and consensus, so we can discard the highly corrupted reads and then have a better quality on the decoding thanks to a better consensus. And also the use of rotating codebooks to increase randomness in the encoded oligos and minimize the impact of the sequencing errors. In the medium term, we also propose the use of autoencoders for DNA coding, since they promise a much higher compression. And also the development of deep learning-based base calling algorithms, but adapted to constrained dictionaries, since it's mostly the case on DNA data storage. And in the long term, we expect the development of standards to ensure the interoperability and long-term decodability of the data, and also the creation of new encoding algorithms for N-based polymers, which would work in the same way as DNA, but the symbols will be different. Instead of ACTG, we will have a different amount of symbols. And I would also like to point out that during this thesis, we had 2 publications in national conferences with a Best Student Paper Award in Croatia, 5 publications in international conferences like IC, Borositko, and that we are also member of the DNA Data Storage Alliance, and we participate as JPEG DNA experts in the JPEG DNA group, which has led to also 2 contributions for the group. And thank you everyone for listening, and that's it.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. And so I give the floor to the first reviewer. So we can perhaps start with Dominique, with in-house, and then it will be Thomas and Thanasios. So Dominique, please.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your presentation, Eva. It was very clear, and I think it describes very well some of the works presented in your thesis document. And so as a reviewer, I will start by a few comments, okay, and then move to the questions. Sure. So as I said in my report, I found the manuscript well written, good introductions, and good explanation of each part of the different contributions. And I found very many interesting things inside these documents, and it was very pleasant to read. So thank you for that. So, however, I have a main remark. As I said, the manuscript is well written, but it remains relatively descriptive. I mean, in the sense that the strategies, the methods, the results are, from my point of view, not enough compared with, compare or discuss with other similar works. Okay, so the thesis has a strong focus on DNA image coding. Okay, so I was expecting to have more information of the state of the art on this specific domain, just in order to better position your work of this thesis. I should say that I think it's a pity because you have done a great job and its originality is not enough highlighted. Okay. This is my point of view. So except this point, as I said, the different contributions are clearly explained, and we can briefly measure the quality and the quantity of the works of this thesis. I would like to say first that I particularly appreciate the experimentation part. I think it is very important to have this global approach. I mean, design algorithms and confront them with the reality. It's probably the only way to validate this research. So congratulations for that. It was very nice. So there are many people in the jury, so plenty of opportunities for many questions. I will only have 2 general questions. Okay. So the first one is related to my remark. Could you briefly indicate how your work can be positioned related to the state of the art? I mean, what are the other groups working in the DNA image codings? What are the advantages, drawbacks of your approach compared to the other people, to the other groups? Are their approach completely different to code images? I mean, why should I choose your coding schemes rather than the other people?
So yes, it's true that there are some other works that are also encoding digital images. However, it's just few of them that focus on the source being an image and adapt them to that source. So right now, I would say that you could maybe find some other algorithm to use, but we are trying to go towards the standardization as well. So if we have this kind of data, we will have this algorithm that it's adapted specifically to it. And like if we manage to make it homogeneous, then it's when we ensure that our data will be able to be decoded by someone else, or even in the future to ensure the decodability. Maybe if you use some general approaches, I wouldn't expect that some general approach that focuses on any kind of binary data and applies transcoding, even if it has been adapted, will be the future of DNA coding. Because that's not the case right now with binary file systems that we have. It depends on the type of data that you are treating, and it should be the same for DNA. And that's why we are also working with the JPEG group to push the creation of these standards, and even the DNA Data Storage Alliance. We are trying to make it work among all of us.
Okay, thank you. So the second question is related to the nanopore technology. So you have experimented this technology to read the encoded images. Can you motivate the use of these technologies? I mean, today, or maybe for a while, synthesis will be limited to short oligonucleotides that could be directly sequenced by, for example, Illumina technology, which provide much better quality. Okay, probably that the quality of nanopore will continue to increase, and I am not sure it's cheaper when you get a large volume of data to sequence on when it is done in routine. But are there some other arguments in favor of this long-read technology? By extensions, do you have any ideas of how to produce longer DNA sequences?
So right now it's being researched new methods for DNA synthesis. One of these methods, for example, consists on pre-building very short DNA sequences of few nucleotides, maybe generally between 5 and 20, more or less. And once you have these predefined words, you can just replicate to have your pieces and merge them into longer sequences using an enzymatic approach. So using that approach, what we would achieve is to be able to synthesize longer strands and do it in a faster way, because you need less amount of cycles to merge, rather than if you are doing it nucleotide by nucleotide. And since right now this is a very big area of research that promises to allow a much better sequencing, this is mostly one of the reasons of using nanopore. If you look at the future, probably in few years, you will be able to easily synthesize longer DNA strands, while for Illumina, the length of the read that can be read with this device is limited as well to a few hundred of nucleotides. In our case that we were working with 200 nucleotides long sequences, when you do it with Illumina, you cannot read the whole strand at once. You have to read from both ends and after merge the results. And the other point of the use of nanopore is that it's more user-friendly. It's cheaper to get the device. You don't need big computationally requirements. You can plug it directly to your computer and do your sequencing run. It's a device like this size. And I think there are some flow cells, which is what contains the pores that the DNA goes through, that cost around 60 euros. So if you compare these 60 euros with, I don't know exactly how much is Illumina, but it's obviously much more than that. And it's also a big machine. So it's going to be, in the long term, I would say that nanopore will be, because of the portability because with the new sequencing technologies, we will need to read long reads, which we cannot do with Illumina.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. And so now I give the floor to Professor Thomas Ainis from London.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And a very nice presentation and a very nice thesis overall. A bit of a shame that you had to focus on only certain aspects in the presentation, but that's how to work with time constraints. I just wanted to follow up on the question of Dominique and kind of it's an interesting question and in the sense that nanopore sequencing has become so much more precise, accurate over time. Probably going to be very accurate in a couple of years with the new version, of the pores. So if we want to read in 10, 20 years time, do we actually need to take kind of error detection into account, or do we actually need to take, do we actually need to make this a bit more complicated?
Sorry, to take what into account?
So do we just need to make it more robust, the sequencing process, by the choice of code words, right? If we're assuming that it's going to be 100% correct in a couple of years' time, 10, 20, 30 years, it's long-term archival at the end of the day. Could we not just synthesize it today and just hope that it's going to be accurate in a couple of years' time?
Well, yeah, we can just trust that in the future we will be good enough, so we don't need error correction mechanisms. But all this takes time to develop, and if we don't start now, maybe by the time that when it comes, if that's not the case, we won't have the algorithms. We will have the technology, but not the algorithms. Right now, it's the other way around. Maybe at some point, the sequencing will be accurate enough, so we don't need any error correction mechanisms. But for the moment, I don't think you can leave it to chance, just to wait to see.
Yeah, it would be a bit of a hopeful approach, yeah. Then I want to talk a little bit about the in-painting approach. I thought it was quite interesting. Could you explain, because I wasn't quite sure if I understood in the thesis, the choice of the in-painting algorithm?
You mean in the contribution presented on the here, or the in-painting that we propose as a contribution, the thesis?
So in the thesis, yeah.
You mean the in-painting adapted to the wavelet domain?
So you, basically on page 37, I believe it's 37 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, exactly. You motivate why you use this specific algorithm by Bornemann and Merz. And I was wondering, I didn't understand why you chose that specific algorithm.
The texture synthesis.
Sorry, I don't understand.
The algorithm of texture synthesis for in-painting that we propose for the wavelet domain. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So we chose that one because the one that I will use. Okay, I will start by introducing something. Maybe better if I put it here. Sorry, it's the setup. You cannot see my screen anymore, no? I have to share my screen again. Sorry. It should be this one now.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can go here. Sorry, with all this setup, it's very difficult. So one of the main, for example, one of the main problems that we have, I think is this. Okay, so most of the in-painting algorithms, they are focusing either on treating small errors or large areas. However, the errors that we have are kind of mixed. We can have like spots, we can have lines, we can have like crisscross patterns, and there are not many algorithms that can handle errors that have such a different shape. So what we proposed was to add before in the wavelet domain. This would be one wavelet subband, and here what we do is to use texture synthesis because since we don't know exactly the size of since it's not either small errors or big errors, with this algorithm of coherence transport, what you do is to check other parts in the image where there are no errors that are kind of correlated to the area where you want to do the painting, rather than just checking the neighboring pixels around. So instead of limiting the search to the neighboring pixels, we are trying to expand the search to other areas.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question, which is more like a little bit, I'm asking a bit for a comment here, because you did for kind of variable length encoding, or you made it more robust for JPEG. But there are other formats out there that kind of like, have a variable length encoding for other type of multimedia, for example. And it's not a bad thing, but in the thesis, I kind of was hoping to see also discussion how this could be extended to other applications, formats, and so on. Can you comment on that a little bit?
This extended to other applications for what? Sorry.
To other kind of variable length encodings, or to other compressed formats, etc.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean to extend the variable length that we have proposed, or just variable length for other applications?
The one for the variable length encoding you've proposed, how this basic idea could be applied to other data formats for I don't know, compressed formats, to store them on DNA.
So basically the one that we use, if I go back to the schema, give me 1 second. There we go. So exactly the same as it is, this workflow cannot be, I don't think it's easy to extend to other type of data because it's applied for images, and that's why we have the discrete Gaussian transport in blocks at the beginning and all that. However, it's using ternary Huffman with Goldman for the homopolymers, and then the values with Perkle. So I think this part could be easily used to encode any other type of data in a variable length way. For example, it could be used ternary Huffman, but instead of with the pixel values with the DC or AC coefficients, it could be just with text, or it could be used with other type of data.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. And now it is a turn for Professor Athanasios Kodras.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. I would like also to thank Eva Gil for the presentation. I actually had noted a couple of things to ask, but they are more or less asked by Thomas before me. Starting from the last question of Thomas, it was how this method that you have proposed for the error correction, how does it apply to other standards and not JPEG?
So error correction as in the mapping algorithm, or which error correction? Sorry.
The one that you have shown in the previous slide. Yeah.
So you mean the mapping algorithm to robustify?
Okay, let's say about this. Yes, I just try to understand how much effort does it need in order to use this on another coding scheme that you might have, compression scheme.
Well, this one could be used in any scheme in which you are using vectors in your encoding, because it's a way to map this quantization, when in our case, the quantization vectors to the DNA code words. So you need the sets, your dictionary, and you need your code book of vectors, and then you can apply to any other schema in any other workflow. But you need to have vectors and words. It can be, in our case, it's quaternary words. In the original case proposed by the marker, it was binary words. So you could further adapt it to other dictionaries, but still you will need to have your dictionary and your code book of vectors for it to be applied.
Okay. Thank you. And then going back to in painting, could we have a rule of thumb of how big should the areas be in order to have a good result, or what if they are of some particular shape, if it plays a role? How big means what is the area, what is how many pixels, but I don't know if you have observed any differences between having the same area but of different shape, because this might change the result, the performance of your in painting.
Yeah, so we didn't test for we didn't force to have errors of different sizes. We were just introducing a error in the sequences and decoding whatever it appears. And usually it's depending on in which subband the error appears that the impact in the decoded image is gonna make it bigger or smaller. But since we treat it directly on the subbands before doing the inverse wavelet transform, the worst case scenario that we have seen is that you lose some oligo and then you get this sort of line that crosses the whole subband. But we never found errors that would be much bigger than that. And what we're actually focusing is in treating both these small errors that are due to substitutions that you can see here, the ones in red, while also being able to treat longer areas that might come from losing a whole oligo during the sequencing process.
And in this wavelet case, have you exploited the subbands in order to be helped in correcting the result or doing the inpainting?
You mean to specifically adapt the inpainting to which subband it's being applied?
Yes. Or to take into account the other subbands?
No, we didn't do that, because since the error occurs at the subband level and it's not going to be related to the errors that appear in the rest of the subbands, we didn't think of doing this connection.
And okay, thank you. And if we go to page 45, you mentioned something about slide 45 about transcoding. And yes. And could you please repeat what do you mean by transcoding in this case?
So what we do is to compress the image with classical JPEG, and then we get the binary compressed output of classical JPEG, and we encode each byte into a DNA code word.
Okay.
That was the main.
Okay, then we can. I can stop here, and I understand that the subject that you have treated, you have studied, it's really complicated and difficult because it combines things from different areas, and so one has to learn and to deal with a lot of different things. It's not only image coding, it's not only error correction, It has also to do with the DNA and the structure and the differences. So I appreciate what you have done. Thank you very much for the answers. Thank you
for the questions.
Thank you very much, Athanasios. And now I leave the floor to Anthony Genot in Tokyo.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very nice presentation. So I learned many things because, as it was just said before, you have to straddle many things, many fields, and many disciplines. First, I have a first comment on the slide 3. If you could go on this one.
3?
Number 3, yeah. So yeah. So actually, yeah, this graph it's shown a lot to show that you have exponential explosion of data, but you have to be careful because, for example, then you show that you have 2.5 quintillion bytes per day. And I made some computation to see how much it is in 1 year. And basically, it's about 1 zettabyte of data per year. And the thing is, if you look, for example, at the shipment of HDD or SDD, you have maybe 5, 10 zettabytes. So this data sphere, actually, it also includes lots of data that is transferred, but not stored, like basically streaming, Netflix, all these things. But actually, the storage of data is much smaller. It's typically, maybe we generate 5 or 10 zettabytes, which is still huge. But you have to be careful when you with this. It's just a factor of 100. It's still, but it's interesting because actually it's more about transmission of data, this one, but not storage. But that's not okay. So that was just a general point. And then I had a question about, for example, 36, slide 36. Yeah. So basically, I'm not a specialist. So my question is, why here the transcoding, basically you say it's less robust, for example, than other solution, like fixed length solution based on vector quantization. So why is it that it's less robust? Because you didn't optimize the transcoding for that, or what are the basic reasons for the lack of robustness? That was my question.
Yeah, so for this transcoding method, we basically took the JPEG compressed binary output and we encoded every byte with one of the quaternary words. So since we are using the constraint code that we proposed that will prevent having homopolymers, for that we will be good, and it will also control the GC content. However, for example, for the case of pattern repetitions, if we have the same byte repeated many times, we are going to create patterns there, which is very harmful for the sequencers and decrease the error rate. Also, another drawback is that since we are directly translating the binary compressed output to quaternary, and the binary output of JPEG DNA is variable length, if we have an error, this error is going to propagate until the end. While in the case of, for example, a fixed length code, if we have an error in one of the sequences, this error is not going to affect the rest of the oligos.
Okay. Yes, that's very interesting because maybe it's related to my other question. So, but because can you go to slide 43? 43. Yeah, so because I'm an experimentalist, so I work on a lot of molecular biology and sequencing, and I was very pleased to see that you made the effort of do sequencing and test many methods, and that's why I found it very nice. And I still learned many things. So the thing, if you look at the error rate in the nanopore, actually most of the errors are not substitution, but there was insertion or deletion. And if I'm right, in when you presented your algorithm before, it was more about substitution. And actually, substitution, it's kind of easy, but insertion and deletion, it's a problem because it will shift all your data. And it's kind of basically a big problem with nanopore, and they're working on this. I'm not sure if we'll reach 100%, but even, for example, in your presentation before, you said maybe 0.2% of substitution. It already had a big impact on the JPEG, on the DNA, on the JPEG images. So if you have like 1% or 0.5% of insertion or deletion. So my question is, what are your thoughts about that, about algorithm for insertion and deletion being robust to this kind of errors?
Yeah, so the algorithm that we propose for the mapping of the vectors to the DNA code words, it's only working on substitutions right now because it was the first step to adapt the work of, to extend the work of the marker to the case of DNA. And just trying to fix substitutions, we already had to face many challenges on adapting this algorithm because since we are working with quaternary instead of binary, that means that one, we will have a higher amount of words in each Hamming sphere because we can have more, much more, and a higher amount of words with just a distance 1 to the target 1. That was the first challenge, which means also that your vector neighborhoods have to be bigger. And the second challenge was that we are using a constraint code, which means that the cardinality of the Hamming spheres is different, since we are avoiding using some of the words that are not viable from the DNA coding point of view. And then that means that all the neighborhood of vectors have also to have the cardinality adapted to our spheres. And the first step to do that was if we just treat these substitution errors. So we tested it, we saw the potential of the algorithm, and now what we would like to do is either to change the metric that we are using from Hamming to edit distance, so we can also consider index. However, again, the problem is that the complexity of working with Hamming distance is much higher than, of edit distance is much higher than edit distance, much higher than Hamming distance that only consider the substitutions. So another approach that we were thinking is that we could embed the sequences into the Hamming space, as it's done in the consensus, the clustering and consensus algorithm that we are using. So in that case, you can treat all the errors as substitutions instead of having to deal separately with insertions, deletions, and substitutions. But for the moment, we didn't have time to keep working on this.
Yeah, that's very interesting because actually we're working a lot on nanopores because we are also part of the project Molecular Archive. And with nanopore, we have a lot of problems, and we work with edit distance rather than Hamming distance. So I think with Mark, we probably have a lot to work on this. And that was very interesting for me to learn about that. So I just have a last question about slide 44. Uh, 45, sorry, 45, but maybe one slide was edited compared to the. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it was very nice. I really like this one. Like you were very thorough and you compared everything. That was really nice. I think you just should be careful about the coverage. And so one reason you said the Promethean is better because you have more coverage. But of course, the Promethean is a huge machine and you have lots of reads. And the Minion is like a small desktop stuff. So I think to be fair, you should like normalize the coverage. And for example, say you take 50 from the Promethean, and we do the analysis so that basically you can compare apples with apples rather than apple orange. Because actually, even if you could have a huge coverage, at the end in DNA storage, we'll also need to sequence. So you have a budget of sequencing. And if you have a huge coverage, and it means you will sequence less files. So at the end, ideally, you want a coverage of 1 because, and that's why basically the job of the coder will be to optimize the code so that we can get away with as little as possible. Because if you need 1,000 strand, it's still doable now because we have small files. But basically, if you imagine, like if you need to sequence 1,000 times, it means to get 1 gigabyte of data, you need to sequence 1 terabyte of data. So it's really huge. And I think usually we want to reduce the coverage as much as possible. So that was a comment. But otherwise, yeah, I think like everybody, I think it's a very nice work, and you just showed a very small part compared to the phases, but it's very nice, and it's very nice. Basically, you cover different grounds. Everybody can get something out of it. So congratulations for this nice work.
Thank you. I just to add one thing to what you say, you are right. It is true that that is the case for the coverage. However, what I just wanted to do is to give some explanation to why, since the error rates we just saw that for both of the cases are very similar. They are comparable with PromethION and with the protocol R2C2. However, when we decoded the images, we had more errors in the case of R2C2. So one of the explanations, given that they have the same average error rates for the lower visual quality with MinION R2C2, is that we were taking, in this case, this coverage to compute the consensus, and here the coverage was much higher. I'm sorry if I take the wrong.
No worry. I mean, it's fine. It's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And now it is the floor for Professor Reinhard Eckel.
All right. Yeah, many thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. It was really fun to watch and to learn about your research. So what I'm curious about is really mainly one thing. So what made, so can you talk a little bit about the decision to couple the image encoding and all the image aspects together with the error correction, right? Because like in a way, like the way how storage media are designed right now is that you have a storage medium and it ensures that you store something on it, and whatever you store on it, you get back perfectly, right? And that's how people design storage media. And then you have separately from that, you kind of have the design of encoding things like images and compressing them and so on, right? And this decoupling these things has been very successful, right? And so in your work, you're deviating from that philosophy a little bit. So can you maybe elaborate on that, like what made you do this and what's the rationale behind it and so on?
I'm not sure I understood the question, because with the quality of the sound, sometimes I miss some words. If you can repeat, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, so typically the design of a storage system is often decoupled from the data that you store. So for example, like a hard drive, right, is not designed for images, or it's not designed for text or something. It's just designed for, like bits, and then you put bits in, you put bits out, and usually the interface is designed so that whatever you put in, you get perfectly out, right? And so usually these two things are really separately designed. And in your work, you're kind of looking at a sort of a joint design, in that you're storing images, and then you're looking into, well, how can I, if there are errors in the DNA, how can I ensure that they're not going to have such a big impact on the image and so on? Right?
Yes. No.
Yeah, and so the question is like why do this instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to improve the DNA storage system, like just completely separately from, or detached from the data that I'm storing?
There are also groups focusing on that. For example, in my project, some of the partners focus on databases rather than images. However, in our case, we focus on applications and more completely for images and videos. So as a first step, what we are doing is to design these algorithms specifically for image and videos as well. But I know that there are other groups that focus more on the way that you were suggesting as well, for general archival, rather than focusing on just images.
Right. But the question is like, so the question is like, why do that? Like, so why did you choose that route?
Why did we choose to focus on images?
No, not to focus. Yeah, like no, not to focus on images. I mean, but why focus on specifically designing in a way a DNA storage system that works well for JPEG compressed images?
Because since right now all the processes in the storage channel are prone to add errors in the sequences, as a first attempt to avoid or to correct those errors, it's easier if you adapt your encoding to your source, rather than having something that will work for any binary data, for example. So since at the moment we are dealing with this constraint of the noise that is introduced, the first approach to do that is to adapt to the type of data, so to be able to target better the errors and the way that you are correcting them.
Yeah, okay, but let's say then, you know, like let's say then your the way how you store images changes slightly, right? Then you would have to change the whole design again, right? Like the design of the whole storage system.
I didn't understand, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, so okay, but then the thing is like, so you know, so like JPEG, for example, now you this JPEG 2000, right? So every couple of years,
Yes.
I mean, like this changes to some extent. For example, now people are looking in machine learning based ways how to compress images and so on. And so if you design everything together, then once one element changes, then you have to redesign the whole thing, right? Like, so even if your goal is just to store images, right? Like then in a way, everything is so tied together. So you cannot really, like once one element changes, for example, how you store images, then the rest is really hard to adapt, right?
Well, in our case, we would only have to adapt the encoder and decoder, which is, I mean, the technology for the DNAs. Even if it changes, well, as we said, we have to adapt also the encoding to the synthesis technology, for example, or if we are using some sequencing method that is more error-prone, we also have to address this higher error rate. But apart from that, inside the system, I'm not sure how it will affect the encoding or decoding that we proposed, because for the moment we don't have available any. I personally right now wouldn't know how the whole storage system will work together, because it's involving biochemical processes. It will be involving also hardware that will control all the manipulations. So I make things about all these fields that I don't control. I don't know. I don't have the knowledge.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer. So the next person will be to speak will be Professor Olgica Milenkovic.
Hi, Eva. Thank you for a great talk, and truly enjoyed it. I have some questions that probably overlap with the other ones raised by the committee. Maybe a word of caution on one slide. If you can go up and discuss the length of the oligos that are currently used. I think you mentioned length 300 and right. It depends really on the company you work with. And lengths limited to 300 is not quite true, because we have something called G blocks. Researchers that work in synthetic biology are really interested in replacing parts of a whole gene. And IDT has been producing gene blocks for a very long time. They go up to length several thousand easily. So in those G blocks have been around, I think, even for the experiments we used with the nanopores in 2017, 16. G blocks have been highly, highly accurately synthesized. So one other question related to your nanopore experiment is what we saw even these 6-7 years ago was that obviously nanopore technologies are long read technologies, and they work the best. The base calling accuracy is much, much better if you have longer reads. That's why, for example, in our sequencing lab, they would never even try to sequence something of length less than 200. So if you ran the wet lab experiments on short blocks like that, it may have contributed to some errors that you wouldn't have seen in longer blocks. Because when we used G blocks, we saw even in those days when nanopore sequencers the cell flows were of much worse quality, we got much smaller error rates. So did you try or think of doing something with longer blocks? Because I don't think Oxford is the right technology for O-pools or oligo pools. They're just too short for ONT. Did you try anything along those lines, or?
Yeah, so at the beginning of my thesis and during my internship, we were trying to use longer sequences. However, we also had constraints with the budget for the synthesis and the wet lab experiment. So the synthesis that we chose was the one that was adjusting the most to not only the experiment, but also the budget that we have for the wet lab.
Yeah, because the goal, I think in the future, people would really want to move to longer strings, because the overhead you need for addresses, the overhead you need for error control coding diminishes your effective storage rate quite a lot if you go with short block lengths. Imagine every block of length 100, you need to add 20% for the address and 10%, 15% for error correction. Then you have very little space for the actual user information encoding. And that is very different when you work with longer blocks, because the address would be still 20, let's say 20 nucleotides, and you have effectively a much smaller reduction in the overall rate. So,
you are totally right with that. But at the moment, the oligos that we could order were specifically these ones for our experiments, so we had to adapt to the short oligos. And it's also, even if it could be better with longer oligos, with the evolution of nanopore at the beginning, in all the papers that I was reading about this technology, they were saying that it's not good to sequence strands that are shorter than 1,000 bases. Then this value started decreasing, and at some point we stopped reading anything about a limit on the length that they can sequence. So in that sense, since this technology has also improved, it allows us to do the experiments for these shorter oligos. But you are definitely right that the longer the sequences, the better it would be.
Yeah, I think your results, because I think the error rates look a bit high, which is also probably because of the length of the reads. The other question or comment, if you can go to the description of variable length versus fixed length coding.
Description of them?
I think you had the boxes. Sorry, I don't see that well. Yeah, no, I think you had a comparison with the errors going up and down.
A comparison with
you had a no. I mean, sorry. Can you go up? It was way up. I didn't notice the slide number. I'm trying to see. No. Can you go up? Sorry, or was it down? No. Sorry, down, down. You had the errors going up and down in a sense that why is variable length better or worse than fixed length?
Ah, the arrows. Okay.
Yeah. There it is. The green.
I misunderstood. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think this is related to Reinhardt's question, and the question is basically Reinhardt and I think come from a more information theoretic community, info theory and coding theory in my case specifically. So we know that, and I think that's what Reinhardt was heading at. There are methods out there from classical joint source channel coding, and I'll probably elaborate on that a little bit more. So I agree, when you have fixed length solutions, if you fix the length of the encoder, the compression rate could go down, but it's not really true in general, because there are classes of codes that can be used instead of Huffman codes. For example, I don't know if you have heard of Tunstall codes. Tunstall codes are pretty much giving you the same performance as Huffman codes, but they do mappings of symbols into, or groups of symbols. That's the whole point. You group a variable length of symbols into fixed length code words. And then even if you have a substitution error, you can still correct that error without having catastrophic error propagation. So there were a lot of people in the source coding community that worked on Tunstall codes. Then there were a lot of papers in the storage community on joint source channel coding, where you try to do how do you deal with error propagation issues? Even if you want to just use something like Huffman codes, how do you design the error correction scheme to follow Huffman so that you still prevent catastrophic error propagation? So if you Google, I think a lot of the work has been done in UCSD. it would have been good to maybe give an outline or some set of comparisons or explanations why these classical approaches that involve what we call joint source channel coding would not solve this problem. Why did you have to come up with novel solutions? Because the compromise between compression and robustness is really something that information theorists have looked at for a very long time. I think it would be good to put that in perspective. Even if you can just do a literature and review and point out what's wrong with the joint source channel coding approaches. And I think what Reinhard probably meant is Shannon's theory of joint source channel coding says that it's optimal under some very mild conditions to do separately source coding and separately error correction coding. And I think the question is, why couple them if Shannon suggested that you shouldn't, you will get the optimal solution anyhow if you do a decoupled approach, if you separately treat compression and robustness. And I think you have a really good case to make here, because the DNA storage channel is not a classical channel that people have investigated. There are some correlations in the data that are not considered in Shannon's model. So Shannon's model holds for, or result holds for very specific data assumptions. And I think it would be good to probably check this work on joint separation of channel and source coding, because then you can give a better explanation. Why are you coupling these approaches? It's the type of modeling assumptions that you use rather than the type of modeling or constraints that Shannon put up. And just the final question that I have is related to inpainting. If you can go to the method you described for inpainting.
The 1%,
you had a reference. Sorry, I'm really bad with slides. You had some references, the type of method you used for inpainting.
In the experiment in the web.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So that was here.
Right. Okay. So this is the work you use, fast image inpainting. Okay, based on. So what we did, you probably know that we did inpainting in that paper. I think you cited it as Pam,
yes.
as well. So our goal was to deal with both types of errors. As you pointed out, if you have missing oligos, we would get large patches, which we basically detected using separate encoding of RGB channels. And when you had those granular errors, those are more coming from actual sequencing errors in the oligos, let's say, themselves. But we had no problem whatsoever dealing with those errors, both of them simultaneously, using more recent inpainting approaches that are based on deep learning methods. So the citations you have here, you use something from 2007. I think the inpainting methods like the ones we use are much more efficient, I would think, nowadays to capture both types of disturbances. Am I missing something, or did you try?
But this one is sorry to cut you here 1 second, because I guess we are not talking about the same inpainting method now. So this is the inpainting that we propose to assign a value when we have an error that cannot be decoded. But in the contributions of my thesis, the one that we present is what we were discussing earlier. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that we use a discrete wavelet transform to decompose the image before quantizing. Mm-hmm. So we need to find one that could be applied for in the different wavelet subbands before doing the inverse wavelet transform. So to do that, actually the contribution here is not the inpainting itself, but the automatic detection of the damage that we do following in 2 steps again. And first, we check the errors that are due to substitutions, and those are these small errors that you can see in red that just cause a small distortion. And in the second phase, we check the errors that come from index. That is the one that we have a higher visual impact in each of the subbands. So then to inpaint those, we use a state-of-the-art inpainting algorithm. But actually the contribution here is to adapt the inpainting to the wavelet domain, while also being able to automatically detect the errors.
But what is specific about the wavelet domain? Because all we did in our paper with inpainting was to say the errors have to be uncorrelated. You take a red, green, and blue channel, and you make sure that you don't store information from different channels on the same oligo, which would sort of, and then we reshuffled because we needed to synthesize it, and there can be some systematic errors with oligosynthesis. We wanted to make sure that the errors are as uncorrelated as possible in the RGB channels. And then we use the RGB channels as sort of a repetition code. You have 3 replicas of the same image with different intensities, but the smoothness in each of these images would tell you where potential errors could be. If you have a disturbance in the smoothness in one area, let's say the R channel of the AR channel, but you don't have it in the GB channel, then you would suspect that the error was there, despite the fact that you don't see it in the G and the blue channel, if I'm explaining this properly. What is different with wavelet coding? I thought that the only thing you really need to do is to make sure that the information is stored separately for the RGB channel, and then you use the RGB replicas as basically redundancy itself to figure out automatically where the damaged area is. What makes the wavelet part harder?
Well, one of the main differences that we have is that we were not using RGB images, we were encoding grayscale images. And that has been mostly also because of the cost, because if we want to do experiments, if it's a grayscale image, it will take less space and we can test more things. So not having the free channels, we cannot do this correlation, so to find the errors.
I see. So then it would be really interesting to take, if you have the money, obviously,
Yes.
to do the encoding for the RGB channels separately and try to detect the damages in each of those images separately, combine it, and see how it would compare, for example, with something that does operate directly without any discrete wavelet transform coefficients or anything, by just looking at smoothness of images, because the smoothness in our case seemed to be very indicative of where the errors are. And then just to be on the safe side, we made the area a bit larger so that if we missed something because of that simple approach, we would still be able to fix it up. But yeah, I think if you try it on all the 3 channels, that would be potentially a good experiment, and see how many more errors can you pick up basically by doing it separately in each channel, because then you have probably a more powerful way to detect the errors, make the areas smaller so that inpainting would work better for the color images.
Thank you for the suggestions.
Yeah. I'm fine. I think I talked too much. Thanks a lot for your answers, Eva. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. And so the floor is now to Dr. Laura Condé-Canancia.
Thank you. I first want to congratulate Eva. Enhorabuena por este trabajo magnífico. And then my first question is about complexity. So you discussed a little in the manuscript, you talk about the differences of using Hamming or using Levenstein distance. So you have a little discussion on that. But then I'm also curious, like in a practical application, how long it would take to have the final images. So I want to know in time, how in the wet experiment, for how long was the promethion working, and how long it also took all the post-processing steps to lead to the final retrieval of the image.
So
do you have any data on this?
Since we started the wet lab until we got our results?
No, so when you wanted to retrieve the image,
okay.
So you run the sequencer for some time, and then you have to do post-processing for the consensus and the decoding, etc. So I just want to know like an order of magnitude of how long that took.
So actually the consensus and the clustering that we did was using the tool developed by our partners in Eurocom. Let me find it 1 second in the slides. That is here. So actually, since we were collaborating with them, they did the sequencing in IPMC, and then in Eurocom, we provided them with the pool of sequenced reads, and they gave us the results after using this tool for clustering and consensus, which I know that has been optimized to make it much faster than what we had currently in the state of the art. If you would like to check, you can check in these papers that we have at the bottom of the slide. But I cannot tell you exactly in time because I just received the consensus sequences and the reads as well. And then for
okay.
decoding is usually faster it was faster for the case of JPEG and transcoding, and for VQ generally it takes a little bit more of time. Also, since the data is less compressed, we have a higher amount of polygons to decode, which might affect a bit as well. But if you are asking if it's something that is like real time or instant, it is not. It takes a bit of time, but it might be.
Yeah, but you're talking about hours or days or.
For the decoding of the images, I can talk about the decoding of the consensus sequences, because for the sequencing and the clustering and for the sequencing, Pascal is telling me that more or less 1 day.
1 day, okay. Mm-hmm. So you were running the Promethean for like around 1 day.
Promethean? I'm not sure. I'm sorry, because it was not me who did the sequencing.
Okay, no, it's okay. I'll take a look to the publication that you mentioned to have an idea about the post-processing. Okay, thank you. So my second question is about so the picture that you show in slide number 33. Yeah, so I would like to know, do you have an idea why the ACD2 does not bring any improvement compared to the ACD? Because at first sight, the way you try to improve the method, and then at the experimental part, you realize that there are not real improvements. So do you have any idea why this happened?
So I think that the performance of the two methods proposed, ACD and the ACD2, is very, very close to each other. And the problem that we mostly have right now with the errors comes also with what I explained earlier when we were designing the mapping algorithm to adapt it to quaternary, to the case of DNA data storage. The cardinality of the different spheres is not the same. And also we have a higher number of possibilities of having distance of ones for each word, which means that the spheres of code words that you have to map to the neighborhoods of vectors, since you have higher spheres and with different cardinality, when you do the mapping, sometimes you cannot ensure that all the vectors that are inside a neighborhood will be mapped to all the code words inside a Hamming sphere. So those are some errors that are due to the kind of data that we are dealing with and that right now we cannot avoid. So we were trying, in the second case, we were trying to gather as much information about the different neighborhoods and also the neighboring vectors, especially around the uncodable word, to try to enrich the algorithm, but our guess is that most of the errors are due to this higher complexity for us with this mapping algorithm that cannot do this optimal assignment for all the vectors and all the code words.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Another question is, so in chapter 4, you were describing that, so you were saying that in your simulations, the channel model that you used, you assume that synthesis is without errors, right? And then that sequencing had the same kind of errors as synthesis. However, I would like to know, did you consider burst errors, or did you think about burst errors? Because my understanding is that the sequencer sometimes, when it desynchronizes, sometimes errors can come like in a whole, like a burst of errors.
Like,
so
sorry?
Did you consider this or not at all in your model?
I didn't get what kind of errors. They can be
Like
considered
error archival, burst errors.
Yes, so with those errors, I think we worst case scenario, we lose the sequence, but that's why we do the PCR amplification and add redundancy, so we can have more chances to not lose this information. It happened actually, now that I think about it, when we did the wet lab experiment, when you format the data, for the case of, one second. For this case of the variable length, the fixed length code, we were also using the mapping algorithm that I presented to treat substitution errors. And what happened there is that in one of the cases, we lost one important oligo regarding the way that this mapping has been done, because it's information that you also have to store. If you use this control mapping, you need to store this mapping as well. If we lose this type of oligos, that means that probably you cannot decode the wavelet subband or the specific part of the image for which you were using that mapping. So you are right, for these errors, what we actually do is, for these important oligos, what we do is to use barcodes, which are sequences. A barcode set is a set of DNA sequences that have a distance among themselves high enough that it can perform a recorrection. I don't know if you are familiar with barcodes. I could show you an example. I have here for sure. I think it could here. Corresponding should be here. Yes. So basically, can you see the PDF now?
Yes, I see it. Yeah.
Okay. So let me make it bigger. Basically, what we use are barcodes that allow for error correction, and depending on the barcode set that you are using, you will have a number of errors that you can treat. So for example, in this case, we have this word that belongs to this barcode set, and we get an insertion here of a G. And since all the words inside the barcode set have a distance among themselves big enough, so if there is one error, the initial word won't be transformed to any of them. We will identify that this is an error because it doesn't exist in our barcode, and then we can compare its distance with all the words in the barcode, and we can find the correct one and replace it with that one. The problem of using barcodes is that you lose compression when you are using them, because the sets you need longer words, and depending on the number of barcodes that you need and the length of those. But in order to store all this important information that we cannot risk to lose, this is what we use for the moment. We further protect with these barcodes, so to be able to correct the errors in case they appear.
Okay. Okay, so while the PDF is open, because I have a question on chapter 6 that I don't think is in the slides. So in chapter 6, you give an encoded method for synthesis by ligation. So I'm not sure I understood exactly which is the link between the motifs that you use, and then the oligos that will be used for the synthesis. So I'm just curious if you could clarify. Actually, it's in the PDF of the thesis, not in the presentation. Okay.
Just because
Okay, yeah, here. Yeah, so it's page 93. If you could just yeah, so you see that you divide the image in tiles 2 by 2, and then so here the colors are for different motifs. But I wonder how that relates to the oligos that you're actually using for the synthesis.
So in this synthesis, what we will have is a predefined dictionary. So in this case, we won't be using any constrained dictionary that we have created like per code. It will be predefined short DNA sequences that after we will concatenate. So we cannot use each of the motifs as a code word as we were using before to encode one value or one vector, because these motifs can be up to 20, 25 nucleotides length. So we wanted to find a way to use those motifs with our data, but while reducing increasing the compression. We wanted to store as much information with each motif as we could. That was the...
Okay, so for you, so one motif corresponds to one oligo, right?
No, different motifs will be concatenated into a bigger oligo, a longer oligo. So you will bind these predefined short sequences, which are the motifs, and you will create a longer strand that will be your oligo.
Okay. So in this example, in this figure, so I guess the order of the oligos in the final synthesized sequence is predefined by these motifs and how the image is represented, right?
Yes, it will depend on the way that you read the image. So you can read it in zigzag, you can read it row by row, but then you will have motif one. Let's say that we go block by block, row by row. We will have one motif here, one motif here, two motifs representing this block, one motif for this one, like that. I don't know if it's clear.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll read the chapter again because there's something that I am missing, but it's okay. It's probably me. I have a last question about the 2-year experiment. So you used the twist bio for the synthesis of the DNA, and then you put it in the capsule by Imagen.
Yes.
Is there anything in between? So when you receive the DNA from twist, and then when you put it in the capsule by Imagen, is there any process that you have to do any?
So this wet lab experiment started actually during the PhD of my colleague Mel Pomeni, and she was the first one that wanted to test the encoding algorithm for images that she had developed here with our supervisor. And they did the first sequencing just with Illumina at that time. And the rest of the sample, it was stored in these captures for 2 years until during my PhD, they were reopened and sequenced again with Illumina to ensure that during those 2 years, the integrity was not lost. And also to encode with nanopore devices, because we had not tested this sequencing device yet in the team. So this workflow is designed to be able to decode that data when was sequenced with nanopore, because actually the initial experiment was just to sequence it with Illumina in the first place. So we don't need so much error correction or detection mechanisms as we do for nanopore, but we couldn't change the encoding to adapt it to nanopore. So that's why we came up with this whole schema to be able to retrieve that data using nanopore as well, not only Lumina.
Okay. Yeah, my question was more practical about if there is anything that is to be done before the DNA is stored in the capsule.
The PCR amplification to add redundancy. And after that, you store it in the seal capsules. I think in these seal capsules, the DNA is dehydrated in the ones that are provided by Imagen. So probably also after amplification to dehydrate the sample and to put it in the seal capsule.
Okay. Well, I have just like one last fun question. Have you by any chance tried to use one of these brand new AI tools that are everywhere now? Like in the last weeks, we have had this explosion of new AI apps to improve images, to improve text, etc. So have you by any chance play about the final images that you obtain in your whole chain? Have you by any chance put in some AI for a final retouch or something? No. Okay.
No, we haven't tried that so far for the moment.
Okay.
But probably we will soon.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For inviting me and for the nice presentation.
No, thank you for waking up so early. You are
no problem.
Anojika.
No problem.
Okay, thank you, Laura. As the president, I'm supposed to finish, but I will let the spot to Mark, because I think that it is more logical. I'm very happy to be there, and I wanted to congratulate you for the work that you have done. And it was a nice visit, and it was very nice also to interact with you during this time. I wanted perhaps to make some comment on the experimental part, and there are a lot of different very interesting questions that were raised during the discussion. One thing that you have not mentioned, and that was for me extremely interesting, and that I liked. For me, the nanopore, I understand all the restrictions that were given to the technique, the interest of having a longer sequence, etc. But at the end, it turned out that nanopore is working quite well with short sequence in our hands. And one example that you should have mentioned, perhaps, was the series of weird oligos that were generated, that corresponded to very, very degenerated sequences, I80 or GC sequences.
Yes.
And these were just nightmare for the sequencing,
yes.
Especially for the first generation of nanopore. It turned out that it was still the case for Illumina. And for Illumina, it was not possible at all to get anything. And with the latest with the R2C2 and the rolling circle, it was not that good. But with the latest generation of nanopore, it turned out that we were able to read these sequences, and we lose a very small number of sequences that were very awful, by the way. So I think that it gave, at least to me, it gave a high confidence about the capacity that we can have, even with short sequences, to get the right signal. And so I think that it is something important. One thing that I was wondering is that at some point, can't we introduce some new information about this artificial DNA to improve the ways that you code. I mean, perhaps has it an impact on the rules that were defined at the beginning? I'm not sure that with that type of sequencing, for instance, we should say that triplets are forbidden.
Yes.
It's perhaps not true, but
Yes.
Have you an idea of how to test that and how it could be a way to improve the approach?
Yeah, so just in case for the rest of the people, to what Pascal is referring is that in the wet lab experiment, we also created sequences that contain all these forbidden sequences that increase the error rate. And that is homopolymers and patterns. So what we tested is homopolymers with lengths from 5 to 10 nucleotides, and then patterns also with using the code words from our constraint dictionary, which have lengths between 2 and 5 nucleotides. And for the results, what we present here is the maximum polymer length that we were able to correctly decode when sequencing with Mi9R2C2 and here with promethium. And here we show the length of the DNA code word, the size of the dictionary, the number of code words that were being tested, and here these values are the number of code words that could be correctly retrieved when they are involved in a pattern. So actually what we found out is that with promethium, the homopolymer constraint, I would like also to point out that this is extracted not from the raw reads, but from the consensus that we created from them, because we have also to allow some error correction, some room. So what we found out is that the homopolymer constraint that is generally around 3 nucleotides for Illumina, and after increased to up to around 5, between 5 and 7 for nanopore, if I'm not mistaken. Right now we can even decode when we have up to 9 or 10 nucleotides length in some cases. And even for the pattern repetition, what we found out is that it's extremely harmful if you have very short words in the pattern, but with the increase of the length of the code words, there is more and more viable code words for patterns in these cases. So, for example, in the thesis series, at some point that I proposed different ways to map the values to the DNA code words, so to avoid the pattern repetition, and instead of having to do that, having this information, we could just use these code words that didn't create any problem when building patterns. So we can force the patterns to be created with these words that have proven to be feasible. So yes, we can increase the dictionary, the size of the dictionary that we are using, which means that we can also improve the compression of the data.
Our experience with large collection of oligos is now growing, even when we are dealing with hundreds or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of oligos, even they are 200 or above, we are able to reconstruct the full information. So that's something important to consider. And again, it doesn't say that we should not try to have longer sequences, but at least it means that we can already work with that. The other thing is that it was nicely mentioned that the number of reads were not necessarily the same for the different experiments. By the way, the promethium would be an interesting experiment to look at, to look with different coverage. What is the variation in quality?
Yes.
And we should probably consider that for the final story. And on the other hand, some shorter, some smaller flow cells like the flongule are very cheap, so that's cool. But at the same time, the throughput will not be very important.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that we will work necessarily with the flongule, except for doing some exercise, but not for large collection of
In the long term, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, if we have a very long oligo, perhaps, but not otherwise. And at the same time, it's perhaps true that we can put all the information in 1 kilogram of DNA, but good luck for replication.
And random access.
And the real point is the development of the good tools for the random access. And I don't know if you have any ideas about that, and how do you feel it should work for being powerful?
For the random access, so most of the works right now have been using barcodes. So with the barcode, you target the file that you are looking for, the sequences that are encoding specific file. Then those sequences are amplified, so you have a higher redundancy of those. And after you read that data, that was one of the main approaches that have been suggested. However, the two contributions in the the two works in the state of the art that I mentioned, discussing about random access, it was actually Olgica's team for both of them. That first they proposed random access for Illumina, and after they extended it to nanopore. However, in our team we haven't worked on that so far.
And probably it also means that we have to order the information in some way. I mean,
yes.
Not considering only the information in a liquid sample mixed together, but probably if it is ordered,
some other system too.
Probably something that is feasible. Okay, well, I will not continue further. Thank you and congratulations. So the last person will be your director.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. So first of all, I want to thank all the members of the committee to take part of this committee and for also the interesting questions. I think that we could discuss hours in the question they asked, and especially on the question why dealing with images is specific. And just on that point, just to inform, the JPEG DNA group is focusing on the source coder for images, specifically for storing images on DNA, and we are focusing on the standard for 2025. So Eva, now I want to congratulate you for your work you have done during this year, and especially for your involvement in the Oligo Archive project. But you did a lot of things, and for example, also writing the report on time, because pushing me on that also. And also for your research work, because the work you did is a large spectrum of skills, especially going from image processing, signal processing, biology or chemistry or everything around this. And it was, I guess, a bit difficult at the beginning to understand everything and to manage everything. And also, I want to say also that the work you presented today is just a part of what you did, and you did a lot of work. Also, there were up and down, during your the finalization of the thesis and the manuscript, but you were able to manage that, and it's a good thing. Also, I want to say that the work you did leaves great perspectives for future PhD students and future work. So this is very good for our team. And the last thing, so you are continuing working on that thanks to postdoc in the group, and probably, and I hope so, working in the company we created, the company in some years. Okay, so congratulations for what you did, and good luck for the future.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being part of my jury and for coming.
So we are at the end of the oral defense. We have now to discuss with the committee? Are we going outside or?
No, we can stay here, but it's just connecting on the other link.
Okay,
So you can connect on the other link, the previous one.
I leave this one on or?
No, you have to switch on.
Yeah, but
No, but it's really a different code. Ah, no.
Yeah, you have to.
So he has to connect with his computer.
Okay, so there is not important the YouTube link. Another one?
It's here that we diffuse it. It's in this room.
Yeah, so if you talk here,
they will hear you in the YouTube.
Yeah, so we shut down the YouTube link, or we must.
If we shut it down, we cannot open it back.
Okay, so we must change.
So you have
So we have to.
I'm sorry.
So we have to move in a different room, and we will switch to the other link to discuss together. If you...
Okay, I will close this call now and I will open it later again.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
So you can let it open.
You can let it.
Okay.
Yes, because we are.
And for YouTube,
it stays right
Oh.
Hemos estado esperando y al final se ha ido. No te conviene mucho que te conectaste ahora para llamar otra vez. Para poder vivir. Sí, sí, sí. If it's in English, yes.
And you can read it first to be sure.
Okay.
I see the assistance. Madame Gil from
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So, ils sont pas connectés. Okay.
So they came back. Two of them told me goodbye, and
Okay.
Thomas at some point left, but I don't know why. And the rest, I don't know.
They are not connected.
They should be in the waiting room. I don't know.
In the waiting room?
No, there's no one in the waiting room.
So
So,
maybe nobody's connected.
So we can.
so maybe we can.
We are on YouTube. This is the most important thing. So the jury has reflected a lot. I thought a lot about what you said, and at the end they decided at the unanimity to confer you the title of Doctors of the University Potassium. And so I bring with that my felicitation and congratulations for this very great work.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, you can. The COVID has finished, and I can kiss you.
Thank you so much.
It was not the case for Melpo.
Yes.
It was forbidden.
Not liking.
And so there is a last thing that is added to the PhD
yes.
celebration, because now there is a text that needs to be said, and so this is a very official and formal time, and I will let Eva say this text.
In the presence of my peers, having completed my doctorate in automatic treatment du signal et des images, in French, and having thus practiced in my quest for knowledge the exercise of a demanding scientific research by cultivating intellectual rigor, ethical reflexivity, and respect for the principles of scientific integrity, I commit myself for what will depend on me in the continuation of my professional career, whatever the sector or the field of activity, to maintain an honest conduct in my relationship to knowledge, my methods, and my results. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that came today. I want to start by thanking my supervisor, Mark Antonini. I started with him my PhD after I did the internship, and although at the beginning I was hesitating, they managed to convince me to stay, and I couldn't be more grateful for that, because it's been a pleasure these 4 years that I've been working with you and also with Melpo and the rest of the team that have been coming after, like Javier and Jeremy recently. I want also to thank you to all the people that I met in the lab and that made every day, every working day to be much more than that. All the rest of the people that I have met around here in this place, the people that have come from far, like Miguel and Melissa. Thank you everyone for coming. And also to the people in the distance, many people from Spain and many other places in the world that cannot be here physically, but we got Zoom, so it's okay. Thank you. And of course, my family back in Spain, that has been the one that have supported me the most all these years, even if it was not easy because they are a bit far away. So thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Vou show it to Mark. Take care not to break it.
Thank you. I'm gonna show you it here.
Nothing there.
Thank you. I love it.
Which one is this? Which one is?
And now there will be some drinks, some food, so we can prepare the things. We can prepare the things and have some apples.